Welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, I'm Isabel. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist as well as a psychological astrologer. And I am joined today by Judith Corvin-Blackburn. Hello, Judith.
Hello, Anna.
And the reason you're here is because I have been reading this book, this wonderful and fascinating book, Activating Your 5D Frequency. So I think a good place to start would be to say, what is 5D frequency?
Reasonable question. It's really about how our cells vibrate when we're in what I'll call a state of higher consciousness, heart-centered consciousness. There's a certain vibration that we experience physically, whether we're conscious of it or not. And that puts us in, that coincides with a particular way that we expand to see our world and to see our lives and really to see ourselves. And what this opens us to is the main characteristics of stepping into a fifth dimensional energy, which I believe is going on collectively. I'm far from the only one believing that. And where we're stepping into characteristics of unconditional love, which includes love of self as well as everybody else. Unity consciousness, understanding how interconnected we are with all of life, with all of creation, and unbridled creativity, which I love, where we're no longer held back by old conditioning or even by old views of what we were told was real and what wasn't real.
I think that last one, views of what's real and not real, that's probably one that many people watching will really relate to, because, and it's still very much, a very limited view of what's real and what's not real within the mainstream. And the problem with that is that it limits possibilities.
Yes. I think it limits people's intuition as well, because intuitively we know that there's much more than we were taught. And, my view is that we actually are designed to be fifth dimensional, and that we were. That in ancient cultures, such as Atlantis and Lemuria, and even very ancient Egypt before the pharaohs. By that time, there was already what I conceive of as a dimensional descent going on. We were fifth dimensional, and it's in our genetic makeup. And it allows us to use senses that we had not necessarily felt our access to.
So what we're saying then is that we have the potential to vibrate at a level and therefore behave at a level which we would associate with something that could only happen in the afterlife.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yes, I suppose that's accurate.
But if we're saying that we have the potential to have a mindset that's so beautiful, evolved with, and that operates on a basis of unconditional love, then that means we have to be very aware of the fact that we are more than what's physical. Yes. We have to be aware of the essence of the power within us, so that we can live without fear, and thereby create what many would call heaven on earth. And that's why I say we have the ability to be here in this physical world, what many of us would expect is only possible in the afterlife.
Absolutely. And again, I hadn't thought to phrase it that way, although the concept that we're bringing, you know, what we conceive of as heaven down to earth is something I've been conscious of. But yes, I love the way you said that. And I think that really relates, people can relate to that.
Well, it doesn't get more exciting than that, does it?
Right. Exactly. And I also like that you threw in how we behave, because that's a really important piece of it. And I do believe that our behavior shifts when we come, you know, when we're heart-centered, when we come from that evolved place, as you say, then we can't do harm to others. We understand we're only harming ourselves, that we're all interconnected, and that our well-being is dependent on everyone else's well-being. So we have to step out at that point of the us versus them mentality. We're all us.
Indeed, and we are one with everything, including our beautiful planet and all the creatures within it, including the creepy crawlies that make it, etc. So, okay. So, as I say, it doesn't get more exciting than that. At which point, I just have to say the obvious: tell us how to do it.
Oh, easy as 1, 2, 3. Well, one thing I feel very strongly about it is it's very much of a process. That this is not something that we get to overnight. And it's also not something we get to in a linear way. You know, some days we'll feel that we're there and it's wonderful, and other days not. And that's a natural part of the process. And I think that's I find that is a really important piece, because people that are aspiring to this, you know, I'll hear my students or clients say, oh, but you know I should have been more 5D. Well, we're human still. And it's impossible to do this perfectly. Otherwise, we would not be on this planet. So part of it is really understanding this is a process. It goes up and down, even though we're always making progress, but sometimes it feels like we're back where we started. And so that's one of the pieces that I think is really important. Another piece, which is really essential, is to be able to understand we're just not all light. We also have the dark, and finding how to be authentic and honest about that, so that we can integrate the darker parts of ourselves so that they do no harm. There's nothing wrong with the dark if it does no harm.
Well, that's a hugely important aspect. Unless we are aware of, understand, and own the darkness within us, we will be driven by that darkness. And that's where we will get into the power struggles and all of the stuff that's messy and that is completely out of the light. And the people who are in greatest danger are those who do not own their darkness. That's absolutely clear. But I have another thought. You know, you were talking about the need for us to be gentle with ourselves, and particularly when we have a day where we're feeling somewhat ratty and maybe haven't displayed our best 5D selves. And that is that we're actually wired from a biological perspective for dealing with, I guess the word I want is danger, you know, and so this is, it's very deep. It's a biological thing. It's the amygdala in our brain. It's the fight flight response. And so we are wired for survival. That was the word I was looking for.
Yes.
We are wired for our survival to be sensitive to potential threat. And so this is the things that we need to understand, is that hardwired into our brains is the survival instinct, which takes us potentially into fight flight behavior. And if we get stuck in that, which is really being stuck in fear, we can have chronic physical issues, but we can also, of course, have chronic, I'm going to call them mental or emotional issues, which lead to behavior which is very negative and destructive behavior for ourselves and others. So we need to understand that. What we are talking about, though, is the fact that we are not merely that, we are also spirit. And what we're wanting to do is harness the spirit side of ourselves to, I guess, overcome the hard biological wiring. And that's a tall order, isn't it?
It's a very tall order, and I think that's well said. I'm not so sure, though, that the spiritual part of ourselves is also not available. I think it's in our DNA. And there's, you know, this relatively new study of epigenetics. And then I'm sure you're familiar with the Gene Keys and Richard Rudd's work. And what that meant for me in terms of this work, in terms of this process, is that we have all sorts of potential in our DNA, which includes, of course, the fight and flight and the survival fears. But what gets activated, really, we have a choice about. That through visualization, meditation, prayer, yoga, whatever you want to, anything that opens us, gets us centered and present, with intent, we can fire up different parts of that DNA.
And that's where the hope lies. But
yes.
in order to do that, we have to conceive that this is even a possibility.
Yes,
more to us than this,
right.
and that we're not just these automatic machines. Some people would say animals. I'm not even going to say that, because I think that animals do have more to them than the mechanics of their biology. So this is a very exciting notion, and it's the very reason why we need to step away from the limits that have been placed on us. And you were saying, you know, by the things we've been taught. And I think it would be great if it was just the things that we are taught. It's the things that are continuously reinforced through the mainstream media, where not of a materialist persuasion,
right,
is decried, denounced, and rejected. So this is a continuing programming that is happening. It's continuous from, you know, our first days, unless we are fortunate and we have people around us who know better. We are submerged in this denial of our spiritual selves.
yes.
Okay, first steps then. Judith, give us those first steps.
Well, what you're saying, of course, is a really important first step, Anna, which is an awareness that there's a much broader reality to who we are, what we can do, what our abilities are. And this is happening to people. People are more and more opening on an empathic level, on an intuitive level, psychic level. Those are some of those senses that really are in our DNA. Some people have had more access to them than others, but those are opening up more and more for people. Sometimes it scares people and they shut it down. Mass culture has said, stay away from that stuff, or it's not real. Even though I taught psychology at a community college many years ago, and one of the chapters in the book was on paranormal psychology. And I asked how many people in the classroom, it was maybe about 30 or so people, ever thought about somebody and then the phone rings and it's them. You know, things that everybody's hand went up. We're having these experiences all the time, more and more so, but we've not had them validated. And in many ways have been told, no, that's nothing, that's silly. So that's a piece of this, of course. The other piece, I think that is probably most critical right now, is that we've been told that it's impossible to create a loving, just planet where we honor each other, we honor ourselves, we honor the earth, we honor the creepy crawlies, as you say, right? It's not impossible. We can do it. And I believe that more and more people are feeling that in their hearts, feeling that desire. The other piece is we've gotten, speaking of survival, we've gotten so close to the edge that it's another way of people waking up. But we have to hold those visions. You know, I know you haven't gotten to toward the end of the book where I really talk a lot about what a 5D planet would look like, but it would not look like all these dystopian things that are being put out in movies and, you know, some books and drawing people. I'm not sure why they're drawn, other than maybe they feel not as alone in their fear, something like that. But we need to keep holding these positive images, because that's what creates. That's the other piece we've been told isn't true, but it is true. Thought creates. And if enough of us are holding a vision, we will create it. We're all energy.
What does create, and quantum physics, you know, is showing that all the time. So right. The real myth is that science is what we've been told it is, and that, you know, that science, that this is something that scientism, you know, it's a religion of science. It's very materialist, very reduction, that says this is what it is, and anybody who deviates from this is not science. And my goodness, are we suffering from that at this moment in time? Mm-hmm. Whereas real science is exploratory, it's questioning, it allows for debate, it allows for different views, because out of that is where the inspiration and the big eurekas come. Mm-hmm. And of quantum physics is a part of that. It's this weird world that, you know, shall we say, normal science can't kind of get to grips with, and yet it is science, it's physics, it's quantum physics. And it's showing all the things that we've known for millennia to be true. And right now, it's like we're accessing it again. So now there was something in I think it might have been the very first sentence of the book, which was not your words. They were, I believe, from the forward. Yes. And it says, we are living in shamanic times. So I think, yes, I like that idea. Why is this? What makes that a true statement? Where's the evidence for this?
Well, again, if you look at indigenous shamans, and understand they were able to enter all sorts of realities, and all sorts of dimensions in order to affect people's health and well-being. And that's what we're reclaiming again.
Yes. So I think what you're feeling is that there is a change amongst many people.
Mm-hmm. There's a global awakening. And yes, and it appears to be bigger than it's been, I would say, at least in 12,000 years, probably longer. And partly, ironically, is the access to the very media kinds of things that are also giving us other messages. And I think the piece that's so important about, as reality, what we call what's real begins to flutter, which it's been doing in ways that were quite unpredictable, at least from my perspective. It asks that we more and more go inside, and that we go into that inner wisdom, and that we call in other, spiritual guidance for that, not to get it from the outside. We might get an idea that resonates with us. We might read a book that resonates with us, but until it aligns, especially in the heart, don't trust it. I don't know how else to say it.
I really like what you said there about, it being about the inner trust, having that inner sense. And I think that it's funny because from an astrological perspective, there is a real impetus here, because in so many ways, the world we're living in is disempowering us.
Right.
It's so disempowering, and it's pushing and pushing and pushing, so that people are becoming utterly dependent on systems which are destroying them. The only way out of this is to stop trusting the system and to trust yourself.
And part of that does, there's a piece that you were talking, the sort of how-to in the 5D piece is, I think we went through this dimensional descent because of trauma. One of the things that makes it difficult for us to really access that inner wisdom is personal trauma. And, whether it's intense trauma or even more sort of calmer trauma, it's about impossible to grow up in our societies without some sort of trauma that disconnects us from that inner wisdom, because that's part of what trauma does. As you say, it kicks off that fight flight piece. So healing the emotional body, we've got the physical, emotional, mental, etheric, spiritual body. And in Western culture anyway, the emotional body is the one that's most out of balance. And of course that can affect one's physical health, but learning to be able to identify, honor, process through whatever our feelings are. Because typically, and I'm going to make up a statistic and say 98% of adults who haven't worked on this have old feelings stuck inside that get in the way.
And that's without even considering ancestral trauma.
Right, which is also in genes. Right.
So, because that we absolutely know is stored in our DNA.
Yeah.
So there is quite a lot of trauma to work through. What do you think is, because I think what we're saying is that there's an acceleration here, an acceleration of awakening.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is prompting this acceleration?
That's a great question. So I don't want to give you a pat answer. I want to just go in for a minute and see what comes on that one. Well, I do think that there are divine cycles. There are things that have been put in place really by ourselves collectively, but we tend to give it to outside of ourselves through our own psyches, through our own emotions. If you look at the Mayan calendar as an example, there are stages we go through. You talked about astrology and the outer planets really having very transformative energy and being in certain configurations that create a collective awakening. So all of that's going on. I guess what I would say is I think there has been a collective agreement that we maybe made eons ago, that now's the time. And yet, instead of it being like, oh, yay, let's just do this, it's like there's still people going, no, change is too scary. This can't be happening. So that there's that resistance while there's a movement to go forward and create an evolved planet.
What do you believe caused us? I'm going to use very religious language here. What do you think caused us to fall from grace?
Well, this is it's so interesting you use that term. I don't know if you've gotten to it in the book, but when I was teaching a multidimensional workshop, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, in the middle of the workshop, it dawned on me that what I'm talking about in terms of the dimensional descent really is very much like the biblical fall, except Eve got blamed. I could go on a rant about the feminine getting blamed, but I believe it's probably what caused it was some sort of earth change trauma. This is Barbara Hand-Clow wrote a book. The name's changed since she wrote it. It was called Catastrophophobia, I think, when it first came out. And, her understanding is that there were some intense earth changes about 11, 12,000 years ago. That appears to be when sort of the final collapse of Atlantis went. And I don't know if she talks about that or not, but from what we know, Atlantis went under with a big earthquake that caused this huge tsunami, which might be the biblical floods. Again, as with any history, who is ever writing it gets their slant on reality. So, if we look in terms of a biblical interpretation, I might have some issues about that, so to speak. I might look at it differently, but there seems to be something here.
Well, it is true that right across the world, the creation myths involve floods. So there is something here that's universal. And I think that there is something about that which is deep in our psyche, because it's there in all the mythology. And then there's also that whole cataclysmic fear that that comes through about the world ending in all sorts of different ways, in right across cultures as well. So I think it's very, very likely that there is something did happen, and that is a trauma that's there, and maybe then maybe that would damage our relationship with our planet and with nature, because in actual fact, if we think about times in which technology was not very well advanced, and we didn't have such secure, warm homes, etc., we were much more vulnerable to the whims of nature. And if we didn't know how to understand that or manage that, that would also then, I guess, add to that initial trauma.
Mhm.
So that's a very interesting thought.
Yeah, it is. You know, now there certainly have been indigenous cultures throughout that have managed to keep their sense of balance, rather than going into the imbalance that the trauma wrought, so that they could figure out their survival needs. You know, certainly what we appear to be finding is that for quite a while on this planet, we had way developed, evolved technology, much more so than we have now. And that's really getting more and more into the mainstream, which is interesting. But if you go from highly advanced technology to nothing overnight, if you can keep that sense of center, you know how to maneuver, but that's asking a lot. If you go into trauma, then you feel resourceless. And what you say is very interesting, that might have caused all of a sudden thinking we have to conquer nature instead of living in harmony with nature, that we stopped honoring, you know, not all of us, but collectively there was a movement that stopped honoring the earth and thought that was the way to survive, which we're finding out wasn't a very smart move, but here we are.
Yeah, we have to learn through our collective misdeeds, I guess, or misjudgments, maybe. Okay, so we, 5D, short for fifth dimension. So I guess it might be helpful to talk us through the different dimensions.
Okay. There are many different systems, which is interesting because there's a system that comes from sacred geometry, which I am not as familiar with. I know a little bit about it. And many teachers are teaching from that one. The dimensional system that really clicked for me came through Barbara Hand-Klaus. She wrote a wonderful book with her husband called Alchemy of Nine Dimensions. And this is information she got from the Pleiadians. And I've read that book a few times because it's been a foundation for me. And what I found is that this was actually, she talks about a 9-dimensional axis, which actually was taught in ancient Egypt and I think came from Atlantis. So and Plato taught it in Greece, which I love. But so this is a very interesting historical lineage here. Yeah, I find it to be a very elegant system. And I'll speak simply into it in a minute, but I do want to say that one thing Barbara does in her book, which I have not done because I can't, is connect all the dimensions to quantum physics. And she does it in a brilliant, it's really just brilliant. So for those people that really want to get into the details of how more, we'll call it more advanced science or broad-minded science is proving these ideas. But anyway, so here we are on planet Earth. And what I believe is that we have access somewhat easily, to 9 dimensions of consciousness. The first one being at the very core of Mother Earth in the crystal iron core. And there's an African shaman who recently passed called Credo Mutwa. And he said in the middle of the iron crystal core is a golden pyramid. And that really resonated for me. If you can imagine this energetic and physical golden pyramid, the energy it would hold, and the reflection of reality it would hold. So anyway, if you can imagine, that's the very heart, that's the first dimension. The 9th dimension is in galactic center. And the concept of using nesting dolls, the Russian nesting dolls where one fits into the next, I think works very well for people to begin to understand. that if you look at each dimension of these 9 as nesting dolls, you'll see we can hold all these nesting dolls. We just have lost our ability to access it. So we have been operating mostly off of our 3rd dimensional nesting doll, which, we all know what that looks like or did until reality started shifting on us. But, trees, ground, flowers, snow, depending on where you are and what the season is. Bodies, physical bodies that operate at a certain level of density. The 2nd dimension is right underneath the earth. It's the crystals. And you can see they all have intelligences. It's not that the lower dimensions are less intelligent, but they just operate at a lower frequency, at a slower frequency. 4th dimension, which I do spend some time speaking about in the book, it's very important. It's a little bit much for me to say truly about in this short period of time, but let me say that it is an umbrella that opens us to higher dimensions if we can clear it emotionally. If we're throwing trauma in there, it gets dense and murky. So, clearing, doing self-healing as well as collective healing begins to open this into more of a light. If you can see a canopy filled with light instead of murkiness, and then we have access to these upper dimensions. 5th dimension, as I said, heart-based, unity consciousness, creativity. 6th dimension, 5th dimension is kind of physical, and that's, again, that would be a long conversation. It's physical, but it vibrates more quickly. So it's more like our light body. We're still in our bodies, but we're lighter, literally emitting more light, absorbing more light, more enlightened. 6th dimension, I think, is where we really create physical reality. It holds all the energetic blueprints, anything you can think of ourselves, our souls, of any quality. And Plato called this the world of forms, by the way. 7th dimension, it's connected up with sound. 8th is light, but it's the divine light, blinded by the light. It's a different quality of light than we can absorb through our 3rd dimensional eyes, but we can experience it. And 9th dimension really is resonance, which many of the creation stories in the beginning, there was the word, right? And they're all interconnected. At this level of our development, I don't see us going up to 9. I think we're doing really, really good if we can get into that 5th dimensional frequency. When I hear people go, oh, I'm from the 37th dimension, I don't know what that means. So whether it's because I'm just too grounded on this or what, I prefer to stick with those 9. Certainly there are other dimensions and realities, but this gives us some very clear guidance, if you will, and very clear way to activate it in ourselves.
I think that's fascinating. The way that you were describing, was it the 5th dimension, about the body becoming more light? Because when I've been meditating, on more than one occasion, I can see an image of my shape, and it's just like light beaming through it and in it. And I can't feel it, but I can see it. And I'm thinking, is this my imagination? Well, if it is, it's not something that I don't know where the idea came from, but you describing it, that's exactly what I'm seeing. It doesn't happen all the time, sadly, but it does. It has. And it made me wonder whether that's the beginning of something shifting at that moment in time.
That certainly makes sense to me, Anna. And I think what also is interesting is, we have different favorite senses. So it sounds to me at least in meditation, your go-to is what you see.
Mm.
And then you'll begin to feel it. Some of us might, like I tend to be more sentient, so I can feel it before I can see it. But I think, again, it's happening collectively, and we're going to be able to access it in many different ways, which kind of supports that movement. But I would absolutely trust that.
Well, that's also interesting, because when you talk about, the feeling, because I actually do think I felt it, but I haven't connected the image with the feeling because they're not happening simultaneously.
Interesting. Yes.
So there
Oh,
happens when I'm meditating, when I don't have this thing, where people feel like they're leaving their bodies. I don't have that. I've never had that. But do I feel like I'm flying, and this extraordinary blissful joy that feels like light all
yes.
around and in me? I just hadn't connected it to the image, and I hadn't thought about the image except for what you said. So very thing, I just hadn't made that connection.
Yeah, it sounds like you have now. It's going to be really cool when you feel it and see it at the same time.
Yeah. Here's the thing. So, and I'm sure that lots of people who come across this interview or who are reading your book have this experience. We get into a deep state of meditation. We connect with our spirit guides. Things happen. And it's so dreamlike that if I don't write it down, it's gone.
Mhm.
How do we? I think you know what I'm going to ask you. How do we hang on to this for just that bit longer when we open our eyes? How do we manage to do this? Obviously, it has a very profound effect on me. I write it down, the things that they are, and sometimes it's just this little image, and I know what it means, and I write it down. And, before they used to be like words and things, and that was, really exciting. Now it's like they give me hints and I have to work it out for myself. and, and so it has a very deep and profound effect. But what I'd love to be able to hold on to that feeling throughout the day, or even for just, an hour. It would be good.
I think it's really sort of a practice, right? Which is to breathe it when you can, to try to breathe it throughout the day. I think that when we get deeply into our heart and into that space of our hearts being opened, it begins to give us that feeling. Because the tricky thing is we want to bring it into the body. We don't want to leave our bodies, because then we might as well just go off to a different realm. There's no reason to be on the planet. The planet needs us right now. And so we want to learn more and more how to embody this. And I also think it's going to be different for everybody. But of course, what you say is really true. These images come, they're like dreams, where sometimes you wake up and you can remember vividly, but other times it's like it's gone. However, it does stay inside of us, even if we can't remember the details of it. So I think that's another thing to remember. You've got this experience, and at least in my own spiritual development, I started with a glimpse. It's like reality sort of opened. And when I was a teenager, I would have told you I was an atheist. That's the way it is. And then in my 20s, all of a sudden I started having these experiences, which really made me realize, oh, wait, what I thought was true was very limited. And but I would get a glimpse of what we would call higher dimensional consciousness, perhaps. I wouldn't necessarily have the words, but I knew it was, I was reading Yogananda. I knew enough cognitively to have a little bit of context for it. But I also knew that I wasn't developed enough at that point to have this working all the time, so to speak, that it was like I got this glimpse, but then little by little, and it's been very little by little, because that was 50 years ago, practically, um, does that get more and more incorporated in a consistent way?
I think it's really difficult sometimes because we have this beautiful experience, and then the day goes on. And as the day goes on, we are exposed to other people's sadness, other people's anger. We are exposed to the collective fear, which is permeating the air we breathe at the moment.
Right.
We are exposed to so much that's dense and heavy, that it's very difficult to hold on to that light that we might experience. So how do we do that? How do we strengthen ourselves so that we are less affected by, I was just thinking, one of my guides, it's made me smile. I think he'd smile to hear me say this, but he's constantly talking to me about the need for stillness.
Oh, beautiful.
And, yeah. And I always know it's him. He comes in the form of a Buddhist monk, and whenever I always know, because I just get this immediate feeling of stillness. And so much of what he brings me is this idea that to cultivate stillness. And I always ruefully say to him, it's easier where you are than here.
Well, really, the concept of stillness, and I'm going to throw another word out of spaciousness. To me, these are very feminine concepts. And as we're pulling back the sacred feminine, we're understanding how important this is, where our culture has been very male-driven without the balance of do. And so that's a piece of it, of really making that time and remembering. I mean, it really, in a linear time, 30 seconds, you can go into the stillness. And it reconnects you. It's just one, remembering to do that, remembering you can do that, and then doing it. The other piece, when you talk about how we're absorbing so much of the fear and pain that surrounds it, how to begin to protect ourselves energetically, is also really important, which is, to wrap our energy field, not wall it, but just kind of wrap it in a way that we don't take on what's not ours. What's ours can throw us off. That's enough. We don't need everybody else's coming in at one time. So again, the more you're tuned into your own process, your own emotions, your own essentially what's yours. What, if I get a feeling, is this mine or is this coming from the outside? And I need to be able to learn how to discern that. And then simultaneously, if it's not mine, ask that it heads out, because it's not helpful. It's not helping the planet. It's not helping me. If it's mine, then using, whatever tools I have to be able to get in touch with it, move through it and out the other side of it. So that's asking a lot. It's not easy to be a conscious human.
But actually being conscious is the operative word there, because one of the things that I always work on with my clients is getting them to be aware of what they're feeling.
Yes.
And if you are aware of what you're feeling, you are in a much better position to say, okay, well, what's going on here? And then we can begin to ask, okay, is this mine or is it somebody else's? And then begin to detach. That's another favorite word that's coming in from the same guide. and stillness. He keeps instilling these ideas, which I fully appreciate, are very important, and which I think most of humanity struggles with. This, this notion, and then being able to, because if you're able to detach, then you can come back to that stillness. And part of that is breath, isn't it?
Yes.
So it's a little bit, because I'm always talking about breath with clients, the importance of breathing to come back. So tell us about breath.
Well, it is definitely, and there's so much breath work, and there's yogic breath work and shamanic breath work, and we could go on and on, but the breath is the way, we breathe in life force energy, or activate our own life force energy through the breath. And also it's the way to reach the stillness, which is to use the breath to calm and to center. And as you were talking, I wanted to respond to something, but now it's kind of flown away. It may come back if it's important. Yeah, I don't know what it was.
I know that. Right. Yes, indeed. And I guess I might just mention to our audience that if you are interested in more interviews to do with breath, then check out the one I did on Kriya Yoga with Keith Lowenstein, because that's a really good one that talks about yoga, but specifically the importance of posture and breathing. And I think these are all practices which help us. So maybe what we're saying is that in order to activate that 5D way of being, which is about having that open heart, there are different layers of work that we need to practice. We need to clear our own trauma, which basically means healing ourselves, being aware of collective trauma, ancestral trauma, and so be gentle with ourselves as we unravel all of this. It's developing a spiritual perspective, which is about unconditional love, forgiveness, acceptance, and all of that. All of those words trip off the tongue so lightly and so easily, but this is the stuff that we need. These are muscles which need to be worked on, and it's very, very difficult because it brings in things that we have to deal with, like injustice, etc., and understanding that acceptance and forgiveness are different to condoning and colluding. Very, very different concepts. So we need to get our heads around that. We need to do things like connecting with the earth, grounding ourselves, maybe gardening. This is where crystal work comes in, and things like that, where we're actually working with the earth. Because you'd actually, as you described, all the different dimensions, this is in all of them. So it needs multi-level, it's multi-leveled approach, and it's like work because it's multidimensional. So it's very beautiful to look at it like that, isn't it?
Yes, right. And I think it helps us go easier on ourselves because it's both multidimensional on a vertical, in a vertical way. It's also multidimensional when we're dealing with all our other lifetimes, past, future, present. This is complex stuff. And while we don't want to get stuck in the details because it's too complex, and then it gets the left brain, trying to figure things out that perhaps don't really help us or propel us forward. But it does help to understand this is the big job we're all doing. Exactly. And to go easy on ourselves about it, and to cheer ourselves on when we make a little progress, when we're feeling that bliss and we're in that stillness 40% of the time. instead of 25% of the time, or whatever the day might be. So I think that's an important piece. The other piece, I remembered what I was going to jump in on when you were speaking about how important awareness is. I think what people tend to not realize is that anything we keep unconscious actually runs more power than if we bring it up and into consciousness, where then we are more empowered to deal with it. So, and I think that's kind of a myth in our collective myth, that just ignore it, just push it down, and somehow it goes away. And if anything, it gets stronger. So bringing this out into the light is really important.
And our myths are full of the, the lesson of how important it is to bring everything into the light, because the light is the very thing that ends the life of the monster. You don't want to have that in you festering and and scaring you in the dark. It needs to come out so that it can be integrated. And now we're in Jung territory. It's very much all of this is about healing. If we want to achieve that sense of opening the heart consciousness and living in it, then we need to be compassionate to ourselves as well as to each other. And the minute we're doing that, we're already activating that 5D vision.
Beautiful. Absolutely.
And so at this point, I want to say thank you very much for your wonderful book, and the title of which is Activating Your 5D Frequency. And I will have a link to this in the description box. Then, Judith, if people wanted to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Well, they can go to my website, which is called Empowering the Spirit. There's a way to contact me through that. They can also email me at healingconcepts@hotmail.com. And I love to hear from people. It's one of the things that's been so much fun about this book for me is I'll hear from people all over the world. And then have students from all over the world. My gift from COVID is it got me on Zoom. And all of a sudden, things were limitless, right? I stepped out of some old limits. And I think that's happened for many of us in the last few years.
Indeed.
And it's created even more, strengthened our interconnections.
Well, that's what this channel is all about. So I want to thank you. I'll be putting a link to your website on the description box as well. So thank you very much for your book and for joining us today.
Thank you, Anna. And I loved hearing what you had to say as well. Glad we're all in this together, right?
Oh, yeah. Thank you all for watching. If you want to also go onto my website, you will find that I run monthly new moon meditations, which might be inspiring to you, as well as learning more about the work that I do. Until next time, have a great week. Goodbye.